Well, good morning, Internet. Welcome to our latest plot tour of the Mynard plot. I am your agronomist, John McNamara, at the Wilbur-Ellis location here in Plattsmouth. And for the 5th of August in southeast Nebraska, we really couldn't be wanting more for crop moisture and crop development. Along those lines, we want to kind of give you an update as far as where the corn crop is, kind of a few things that we've noticed here in the past few weeks, as well as some of the yield potential and how you can kind of start looking at kernel development, as well as how successful you were with pollination. So this corn specifically was planted on the 9th of April, and it's accumulated just under 2,000 heat units, which from a developmental standpoint is good. I mean, we're right on track, maybe just a freckle light on heat units, but nothing big that would limit development as we go forth. Some things that have occurred. So when you look at this as an example, we talk about pollination and ear development and that type of thing. There's not a farmer that I don't know of this time of year that doesn't go into their corn and start looking at how the kernels have developed and starting to do kernel counts and consequently yield potential, which is a dangerous thing in my mind, just for the sheer fact of amount of sampling. So in previous videos we talked about how the corn pollinates, and you can still see some of these silks that are attached to the bottom kernels. As they have continued to develop, it always starts from the base of the cob and works toward the tip. This corn, still a little milky, kind of in that blister to dough stage. So we would qualify this as about an R4 development in corn. Once R4 occurs, a kernel abortion at the tip is very rare unless you have something extreme, whether it's dry weather, hot weather, something to cause that moisture stress within the plant to start aborting kernels back down the tip of the cob. And we'll talk a little bit more about ear tipping here in a little bit. Some of the bigger things in corn development this year is just this. When we start seeing disease development, and maybe it's about as easy for me to just hold this leaf up, gray leaf spot, which are these lesions that you can see right here, occur every year. It's very common. We've had the right season and the right weather here lately to culture a lot of this. Gray leaf spot works from the soil line up toward the ear. And again, we've talked about this all summer long, trying to protect that top third of the canopy. And now that you've reached above the ear leaf, you're thinking, all right, what are the chances of having yield loss? I mentioned the chances of having aborted kernels now are very low. What lesions do, whether it's from gray leaf spot, whether it's from northern corn leaf blight, whether it's from southern rust or common rust for that matter, in this top third of the canopy, it can have some detrimental effects on stalk quality. So, and genetics will have a big role on that. If you've got a weak stalked or weak-eared hybrid, any type of foliar infection above the ear leaf can additionally weaken that stalk. So that's something to consider. Yield loss can achieve two different ways. I mean, whether it's from fall off or a puff of wind in October that we have from occasionally, we have strong winds in October that might cause that corn to lean or lodge, causes harvest losses. So those are things to consider as we go through this. And keep in mind, we'll document and monitor this as we go through. We always want to consider development of the diseases and how it yields. So pay attention to our newsletter on a weekly basis, and we'll show you some of that. But as a whole, the corn crop has developed quite well.
Shown here is a field with compaction issues from June 16th. John McNamara will discuss what it looks like currently in the next segment of the video.
So if you remember one of our first tours of the spring, we talked about the importance of planting depth and or the impact of soil compaction on planting depth. Now that we've reached the pollination phase of development, it's a good time to kind of roll back and look at that same instance, those same plants, the same area that we talked about back then. And this is a great example of how the plant reacts. So you can kind of see from a pollination standpoint, pollination is off. Now it's tried to pollinate some of those ears, but not much has gone on. If you shuck this developing ear back, you'll see that a lot of these kernels haven't been fertilized and probably won't be fertilized as this plant develops. It's trying, but this ear is severely underdeveloped for this time of year. The other thing that goes on is you see some hormonal imbalances when you have compacted soil like this or shallow planted corn. Tassel ears happen every year. You've probably seen them along the edges of the field. It's a hormonal imbalance, and you might ask, well, how does this happen? How do you get an ear on the tassel? Corn plant is a perfect flower, meaning that it can exhibit the male and female plant structures of reproduction on the same area of the plant, meaning the tassel. So that's not uncommon, and given that lack of kernel development on this ear, doesn't necessarily surprise me. Now when we dig this plant up, and we just had a little shower of rain here, but the root structure probably won't be a lot different than it was. See how platy that is? It's still compacted. It hasn't gone anywhere from what we found in the spring. And if you remember how flat those roots were here about a month and a half ago, they really haven't changed too much. Still pretty flat and underdeveloped, which is what we call being root bound. Sometimes if you transplant flowers from the nurseries, you'll see root bound plants that just can't get a developmental root system together. So if we go further down the row to areas of the field that didn't have compaction, we can see generally a normally developed ear. Corn's planted the same time, managed the same way. The only real difference here was the soil planting depth and the compaction. And that's a normally developed ear. We have pollination all over the tip. It's generally what we would like to see from a developmental standpoint. It's almost to dough, so it's at full R4. Let's look at the root system on it. And the root system will be much different than what we find in the underdeveloped ear, the plant that we had the tassel ear on. See how much more root spread out those roots are? And they're rooting down. Here's your second node, and that's about where the plant depth needs to be. Even at this stage of development, you can kind of tell that this corn was planted in between 2.5 and 3 inches deep. So consider that in August when you're looking at the success level of how you've pollinated your crop, any underdeveloped ears, or maybe aborted kernels. And we'll get to that in the next segment. I'd also like to visit about the success of pollination. I've talked about this in previous segments. If you look at these 4 ears, this is kind of a good to an extreme case of how the corn pollinated. This would be what we would consider a normal ear as far as a development standpoint. We've pollinated that cob to the tip, and we've got about a 680 kerneled ear. Within that same population, we have development like this. And this is troubling just for the sheer fact of you had some kernel abortion here around the butt of the cob, as well as you have excessive tipping back. So let's talk about tipping back a little bit. Tipping back happens every year, usually more weather developed. Maybe it was too hot, maybe it was too dry, maybe the nighttime temperatures were 75 degrees or more during pollination, which we get into things like silk balling or improper pollen movement down that silk to pollinate the kernel. All those things are environmental. What we try to ask you to consider is manage what you can. From a fertility standpoint, from a pH standpoint, from a soil compaction standpoint, all those things that we can control to help limit this development. When you have tip back like this, it has nothing to do really with management. This is more about stress levels, dry conditions, that type of thing. And we see this to some degree every year across our geography. Some are a little hotter, some are a little wetter. But when you see cobs like this, start reviewing All right, what happened? Was this the entire population across the field? Was it a gateway? Was it an area where you had less water, more fertility, less fertility? Those are the things that we ask you to consider in August when looking at ears or developing ears, as most farmers normally do in August. Along those lines, then we start talking about, well, what's that corn going to make? And that's a typical question this time of year, and a gross way. And what I mean by gross is that it's not a real exact science. The gross way to do this is to take the number of kernels counted in the length of the row times the number of rows around that cob, and that'll give you your total kernels. You know, I always count up to about that far because these kernels are a little bit imperfect and not in every row at the tip. But if you look at this, this is about a 680 kerneled ear. Hybrids generally will have rows around the butt of the cob in even numbers. If you have an odd numbered row, that usually means there's something genetic going on that threw an odd numbered kernel cob. Usually it's even. These days you can have hybrids that would be 16 rows around to 20 ears around, maybe 22 rows around if the fertility and the moisture was right. So it just depends upon the breeding back behind that, and that equates into what we usually talk about with ear flex. Ear flex doesn't necessarily mean so many differences around the butt of the cob. It's just basically how that ear can lengthen or shorten during the ear development stage right at pollination. Okay, you're filling out those tips. Okay, so we get back to, we got about a 680 kernel ear here. Take your final populations. Okay, what's your emerged population? And you can do that in 30-inch spacings. That's 17.5 linear feet in 30-inch row spacings. And you count the number of plants and ears within that population. And if all the ears are like this, and this is where it gets unrefined, if all the ears are like this within that 17.5 feet, you can take that total kernel count, 680, times your final stand of, say, 30,000. That gives you the total number of kernels. And then you can divide that by roughly 80,000. 80,000 kernels at 56-pound corn should give you the rough amount of bushels if the test weight is all 56, and if all these ears are the same, which usually they're not. But it gives you an idea as far as how much yield is roughly to be expected. So we always want to provide an update as far as the soybean crop goes as well. These beans were planted on the 11th of May, and they're at full bloom, or R4. As you can see here at the top of the plant, it's still trying to bloom, and here's some initial pods that are being developed. The base of the plant, which is generally how it develops, you can start seeing cells, or there's a 4-bean pod that's just starting to develop. And you can kind of feel those pods, feel the beans within the pod. So this is well on its way in development. August rains, especially in the early part of August, are quite beneficial to soybeans. Even if your soybean crop has been a little drier through July, August rains typically make the crop. We talk about how much rainfall or water the soybean plant wants to transpire in a season. And it's around 24 to 26 inches of water. Actually a little bit more than what we see in corn. But 60% of that roughly is done in the reproductive stages, or right now. So August rains usually bring the soybean crop around. Some people talk about when the county fair is on, it's a good time to get rain. And moisture profile, at least here in southeast Nebraska, really hasn't been too much in question as far as soybean plant development. Now, you can also see some lingering effects of what we've talked about all summer. Here's some lacing feeding, I should say, from Japanese beetle. But you can see how the plant generally grew out of it. And the top third of the canopy, much like we talk about in corn, is generally left unfed on. So insecticide treatments, those types of things in August, which we typically talk about if you have a spider mite infestation or possibly a soybean aphid infestation, which I've seen none of here lately, looking every morning at crops, is generally where we talk about insecticide use in August. Right now, I see no need, and the soybean crop is developing quite nicely. So I want to get a little update as far as programs and things that are going on this summer regarding labeling and approval of Xtend Flex soybeans. So if you remember here a month or so ago, there was some litigation coming out of California that limited the application of any of the dicamba type products used post-emergent on Roundup Ready to Extend soybeans. Things such as Xtendimax, Fexaplan, or Ingenia. Those labels from the EPA are currently being rewritten. EPA gets sued from courts and other groups often, and so in order to address some of the concerns that these lawsuits bring up, labels get rewritten all the time. So the thing to remember is that the EPA label is generally the law. If the EPA has approved the use of said programs and products, that's generally the law, and you can feel free to use those without any reservation. Little update on Xtend Flex soybeans. You know, the process is nearing the end. I expect approval really any day now, in that you're going to have the ability to purchase and use these soybeans in the 2021 season. Part of the reason why we have them here at the Mynard plot is to give you an idea of what they look like, how they're going to compare to some of the products that you've used before, such as 36X6. We've got two numbers here in the Xtend Flex, in the 36XF1s and the 36XF0s. And what this means is it's a 3.6 maturity, it's Xtend Flex, and the 0 stands for the year that it was released, or it was released in 20. Here's a brand new one, another one, 36XF1. It's the next release in that same 3.6. Well, what am I talking about between XFOs and XF1s? Mainly placement. One variety works a little bit better in maybe a wetter, highly bandaged environment. Soybean diseases late. XFOs are a little bit better in a dry land. So we talk about that, and we'll talk more about that as this crop develops throughout the rest of the season. And finally, one last program that we need to kind of focus in on here in August is My Bayer Plus. If you haven't signed up for My Bayer Plus on the mybayerplus.com website, we need you to do that. We as dealers cannot do that. The grower has to do those things. You're going to need your Tech ID card. If you haven't got one currently, they can look up your old card if you've forgotten it, or they can sign you up for a new card if you need one. Basically, you're getting rewarded up to $17 an acre for any and all Bayer products that you may have purchased for the 2020 season. Whether it's Asgrow or DeKalb Seed, or maybe Warrant, or possibly Delero from a fungicide standpoint, all those purchases can get you up to $17 an acre depending upon how many products you have purchased. I can't get you that. You're going to have to sign up for it for yourself. So we've been calling, visiting with folks here in August, making sure that you're aware of the program, making sure that's available to you. That program will also be available in the 2021 season, so you may consider that when looking at purchases for next year.
Shown here is a field on June 23rd with widespread cupping. The cutout in the corner shows a plant that was taken from that field. Now, John McNamara will show you what it looks like currently.
So we wanted to give you an update as far as what we saw on some of the soybean cupping here from a few weeks ago. We're in the same field that we visited with you here a few tours ago, surrounding soybean cupping and what causes it or could cause it and that type of thing. And you still see some evidence of that on some of these plants. You see that leathery type of the leaf. Here's an example of how it cupped right here on some of this older growth. But you can also see how the plant has generally grown out of it. And there are, again, so many things that can cause beans to cup. I think in this instance it was more of a stress during that time of development. It was awful hot during that time. There are a number of things from a herbicide activation, or excuse me, a herbicide use. Adjuvants can do it, certain modes of action can do it, stress can do it. But when you have whole fields that does something like that, that's more of a genetic interaction with the stress of the weather. Now, a couple other things that we've noticed in the soybean fields. We've talked about development. We've talked about it being in R4. Some of the other things that we've talked about, visited about in the past few sessions, is gall midge and vascular diseases. And so when you look at a plant like this that's withering and dying, I mean, geez, it's trying to pod. Why is this plant dying? So it's basically a determination of what the cause is. There's nothing that you can do necessarily to fix the problem. All you can do is diagnose that. So when you look at the vascular tissue or the blood flow, again, within this plant, you can see a lot of this discoloring. You can see a pinching at the soil line, which at this time of year, it can be one of two things. It can be Phytophthora or Rhizoctonia. My guess is it's probably more Phytophthora here than Rhizoctonia, but you know, you need a little bit more of a lab work in order to truly diagnose that. The reason I bring this up is that this looks a lot like the plants might look if in fact you had gall midge feeding on it. We talked about that on the last tour. So this is a really good example of see how it's pinched down right at the soil line. So you know, look for that. Again, documentation of soil diseases is usually the best line of defense for the next year that it comes back into soybean production. So with that, we'll kind of wrap up this week's tour. Always appreciate everyone looking at the Mynard plot. You're more than welcome to do that. We encourage that, to look on your own. If you'd like us to kind of help you along with that, visit with you, meet you down there, we'd also encourage that as well. So we'll be seeing you soon.